Hey, so tonight we're taking a journey back to the Wild West to see what life was really like for cowboys. Despite the fiery clashes at Lexington and Concord, where blood had already been spilled, a remarkable hope persisted among many Americans. They still wished, almost naively, for reconciliation. In the early spring of 1775, the colonies, though bruised and angered, looked across the Atlantic not with hatred, but with a desperate plea. Their vision was not yet one of full independence, but of fair treatment and recognition as loyal subjects with the rights of Englishmen. To many, the red-coated soldiers were not so much the enemy as was the Parliament in far-off London, deaf to colonial grievances. The Second Continental Congress, meeting in the sweltering rooms of Philadelphia, clung to this thread of hope. They drafted and sent the so-called Olive Branch Petition to King George III. Its words were earnest, pleading for understanding, respect, and justice. The signers, some with trembling hands, knew this might be their final chance to avoid the abyss of war. Yet the king received the petition with icy disdain. In his eyes, the colonists had already crossed the line. He closed the American ports, an economic chokehold meant to bring them to heel, and in public proclamations, he labeled the colonists not as citizens, but as outright rebels. But as the delegates in Philadelphia waited, hoping against hope for a positive reply, the colonies buzzed with nervous energy. Across the villages and towns, men shouldered muskets, women sewed uniforms and tended the wounded, and blacksmiths hammered out bayonets and shot. It was an uneasy time. No one knew if war would fully come, but all prepared as if it already had. Among the first significant actions was a daring strike hundreds of miles north. At the edge of Lake Champlain, nestled among thick pine forests, stood the formidable British outpost of Fort Ticonderoga. Its stone walls, bristling with 200 heavy cannons, commanded the region. Yet on a chill May night, Ethan Allen, tall, fiery, and brimmy with backwoods bravado, led a group of rough, determined men known as the Green Mountain Boys. Silently, they crossed the dark waters, the only sounds their muffled oars and the distant cries of loons. In the pre-dawn gloom, the Green Mountain Boys burst into the sleeping fort. British sentries, roused from their beds, had little time to react. The Americans quickly overwhelmed them, barely firing a shot. Allen, bursting into the commandant's quarters, demanded the surrender, in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Startled, the British garrison had no choice but to comply. Within hours, the Americans found themselves the masters of Ticonderoga, its storerooms filled with desperately needed powder, shot, and, most importantly, cannon. Riding the wave of success, a second force moved against the nearby Fort Crown Point. This, too, fell without bloodshed, its meager garrison surrendering almost immediately. The Americans, suddenly in control of the entire Lake Champlain corridor, cheered these victories as signs of Providence's favor. Flush with newfound confidence, the colonial leaders set their sights on an even greater prize: Canada. If the people of Quebec could be persuaded to join the rebellion, it would not only cut British supply lines, but might turn the 13 colonies into 14. 2 expeditions were quickly organized, though the odds were daunting. The first, commanded by the experienced and dignified Richard Montgomery, advanced up Lake Champlain, capturing forts and villages, finally seizing Montreal after a brief siege. The people there, French, British, and indigenous, watched warily, uncertain if these Americans were conquerors or liberators. The second expedition, under the impetuous and ambitious Benedict Arnold, set out from Massachusetts, their aim the distant and mighty fortress of Quebec itself. Arnold's route would take them through the Maine wilderness, a land of bogs, trackless forests, and icy rivers. The men, many just teenagers, hacked their way through thickets, carried heavy boats over endless portages, and faced rain, snow, and biting winds. Provisions ran out. Some men boiled their own shoe leather for a bitter broth. Disease and exhaustion thinned their ranks. Some died on the trail, others turned back, carrying the feverish and frostbitten. Only a few hundred reached the outskirts of Quebec in late autumn, gaunt, shivering, and half-mad with hunger. But even these hardships could not dampen their resolve. Arnold, a natural leader, kept his ragged force together with promises of glory and vengeance. Soon, Montgomery arrived, his veterans swelling their numbers. Together they launched a desperate assault on Quebec during a blinding snowstorm on New Year's Eve. Muskets misfired in the wet cold, and the swirling snow confused the attackers. Montgomery fell almost instantly, shot through the head at the gates. Arnold was wounded in the leg, carried from the field. After hours of brutal close-quarters fighting, the survivors were forced to retreat, leaving behind dozens dead or captured. For 6 bitter months, the Americans clung to their positions outside the city, but disease and relentless British reinforcements wore them down. At last, battered and broken, they withdrew south. Canada would not join the revolution. Meanwhile, the focus of the war shifted to Boston, the cradle of rebellion. In June 1775, George Washington arrived to take command of the Continental Army. Washington cut an imposing figure, tall, stately, impeccably dressed in blue and buff. To the untrained eye, he seemed indecisive, almost passive. Critics whispered that he was timid, afraid to attack the well-fortified British lines encircling the city. But Washington was not idle. Each day, he drilled his men, turning unruly militia into disciplined soldiers. He studied the British defenses, rode out to inspect the lines, and wrote endless letters begging Congress for gunpowder, uniforms, and pay. Secretly, he planned to seize the key to Boston itself, the high ground known as Dorchester Heights, south of the city. Winter brought a stroke of luck. The captured cannon from Ticonderoga, laboriously dragged over snowy hills and frozen rivers by the ingenious Colonel Henry Knox, arrived outside Boston in February 1776. Washington saw his chance. On a raw, windy night in early March, hundreds of soldiers and volunteers worked under cover of darkness, hauling heavy guns and earthworks to the summit of Dorchester Heights. By dawn, the British awoke to see the Americans looming above them, cannon barrels gleaming in the pale sun, threatening the city and harbor. General William Howe, the British commander, understood the danger. To attack up those steep, fortified hills would mean another slaughter like Bunker Hill, a costly battle he dared not repeat. Rather than risk disaster, Howe ordered his troops to abandon Boston. Redcoats packed up their camps, Loyalists gathered their belongings, and the British fleet prepared to sail. On the morning of March the 17th, 1776, as Washington's army watched from the heights, the British ships slipped out of the harbor, their sails billowing in the cold breeze. The Americans marched into Boston as heroes, welcomed by crowds waving flags and ringing bells. For the first time, The colonies had expelled the king's men from one of their greatest cities. The victory, hard fought and dearly won, inspired hope throughout the land. Yet, all knew that the struggle was only just beginning, and that far greater trials lay ahead. The flames of war did not burn only in the north. Far from the snowy hills of New England and the crowded streets of Boston, the conflict reached into the humid pine-shrouded forests and marshlands of the American South. Here, too, men and women were forced to choose sides between loyalty to a distant king and the rising dream of liberty. In February 1776, the rolling fields and cypress swamps of North Carolina became the setting for a dramatic showdown at Moore's Creek Bridge. News spread quickly that a force of local patriots, Minutemen, ordinary farmers and townsfolk, armed with muskets and their fierce resolve, stood ready to challenge a much larger army of loyalists, men who still supported the British crown. These loyalists, many of them Scottish Highlanders who had settled in the Carolinas, believed it was their duty to restore royal authority. They marched through the darkness, their bagpipes playing, expecting an easy victory. But the patriots, led by Colonel Richard Caswell, were prepared. They dismantled the planks of the narrow bridge, leaving only slippery timbers greased with soap and lard, and waited in silence behind earthen breastworks. At dawn, as the Loyalists attempted to charge across, they slipped and floundered, exposed and disorganized. A deadly volley of musket fire erupted from the Patriot lines. In moments, the Loyalist attack collapsed. Over 50 of the king's men lay dead or wounded, hundreds more were captured, and the rest fled into the woods, their spirits broken. The victory at Moore's Creek electrified the region. Not only had the Patriots triumphed, but they had captured valuable supplies, money, weapons, and gunpowder, without which further resistance would have been impossible. The British, alarmed by this setback, decided on a new strategy. That spring, General Henry Clinton and Lord Charles Cornwallis led a strong force southward by sea, accompanied by a powerful fleet. Their orders were clear: subdue the rebellious Carolinas, restore British rule, and stamp out the embers of rebellion before they could spread further. Yet, when they approached North Carolina, they found themselves facing not a few scattered rebels, but an astonishing 10,000 armed colonists. The British commanders realized a direct attack would mean disaster, and so they turned their eyes farther south, to the bustling city of Charleston, South Carolina, the wealthiest port in the southern colonies. Charleston's harbor, glittering in the summer sun, was guarded by Sullivan's Island, where the Patriots had built a formidable fortress. Fort Moultrie. Unlike the stone walls of northern forts, this one was crafted from palmetto logs and packed sand. The fort seemed rustic, almost primitive, but the soft, spongy wood was remarkably effective at absorbing the shock of cannonballs, causing them to bounce harmlessly away or bury themselves without exploding. The Americans, under the leadership of Colonel William Moultrie, had also equipped the fort with heavy cannon and waited tensely for the British attack. On a sweltering day in late June, the British fleet lined up in the harbor and unleashed a thunderous bombardment. Cannonballs rained down on the fort, filling the air with smoke and sand. The defenders, undaunted, returned fire, their shots striking the masts and decks of the warships. On land, British troops tried to outflank the defenders by wading through the shallow waters behind the fort, but the tides, sharp oyster beds, and fierce resistance turned them back. The battle raged for hours, but the defenders held their ground. At last, battered and demoralized, the British realized they could not break the Americans. Their ships withdrew, sails tattered, and the army was forced to retreat northward in humiliation. Charleston was saved, and the legend of Fort Moultrie was born. All this time, a shadow hung over the conflict. The people of England were weary of war, and their coffers were nearly empty after years of struggle with other European powers, particularly the ever-watchful France. Merchants grumbled about the loss of trade, and the government struggled to raise new taxes. Many in Parliament wished for peace, believing that negotiation might yet salvage the empire. Yet above all these voices, one man's will prevailed. King George III, stubborn and proud, determined not to yield to rebellion. Desperate for soldiers, the king made a fateful decision. Across the cold forests of Germany, he hired 17,000 mercenaries, known as Hessians. These soldiers, tough, disciplined, and feared, were dispatched to America, their bright uniforms and foreign language setting them apart from both British and colonist alike. To the Americans, the arrival of these hired fighters was a shocking insult. The king, instead of listening to their grievances, had chosen to unleash foreign troops upon his own subjects. The cry for reconciliation faded. In its place grew a passionate call for independence. Already, some colonies had taken bold steps. Royal governors, once powerful and feared, had been driven out. New governments were formed by the people, for the people. Men and women debated passionately in town halls and on village greens. Was it time to break from the king once and for all? In the halls of the Continental Congress, the question of independence, once unthinkable, now dominated every conversation. In May 1776, after long and heated debates, the Congress finally agreed that the time had come. They resolved that the colonies should no longer consider themselves under the English crown, but should rule themselves. The momentous task of proposing this idea fell to Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. With solemn ceremony, he presented his resolution, resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. His words electrified the chamber. Some delegates hesitated, their hearts heavy with the weight of history, while others cheered, eager to step into the unknown. After intense argument on July 2, 1776, Congress adopted Lee's resolution. But it was not enough simply to declare independence to themselves. They needed to proclaim it to the world. To this task, they turned to Thomas Jefferson, a quiet yet brilliant Virginian, who set to work in a small, sunlit room, writing one of the greatest documents in history, the Declaration of Independence. In soaring language, Jefferson gave voice to the hopes and beliefs of millions, proclaiming that all men are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights, and that governments exist to secure those rights, not to crush them. After days of revision and debate on July 4, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration. With the stroke of a pen, 13 scattered colonies became the United States of America, united in their quest for liberty. As each man stepped forward to sign, he knew the risks. They faced not only war, but the gallows if they failed. Legend holds that as they signed, one delegate remarked, "We must all hang together." Benjamin Franklin, ever quick with wit, replied, Yes, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Their laughter masked their fear, but also their resolve. The news raced through the land. Within days, copies of the Declaration, printed on broadsheets, arrived in every colony. In Philadelphia, a great crowd gathered outside the State House, today called Independence Hall. As an official stepped onto the balcony and began to read, silence fell. When the final words echoed into the summer air, the crowd erupted with cheers and tears. Bells rang out, including the great bell in the State House tower, inscribed with the words, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof." That day, a new nation was truly born, not only in law, but in the hearts of its people. Across the newly united colonies, the Declaration of Independence swept like wildfire. In every village, town, and city, eager crowds gathered to hear the stirring words read aloud for the first time. Sometimes it was the chief magistrate who stood in the bustling market square, voice ringing out above the throng. Sometimes in rural hamlets, a minister read the words from the pulpit on a quiet Sunday morning, his congregation spellbound by the magnitude of the moment. Everywhere, the people listened in awe. Some wept openly, some cheered, some simply stood in silence, knowing that the world had shifted beneath their feet. The ringing of bells and the roar of cannon salutes marked the birth of something wholly new, a nation. But even as the ink dried on this great document, the realities of war grew sharper and more urgent. Now that independence was formally declared, England had no choice but to abandon any pretense of compromise. The colonies, in her eyes, were in outright rebellion, and must be subdued with all the might the empire could muster. No longer was it a conflict for rights within the empire. It was a fight for the very existence of the British crown in America. British strategists, facing the scale of the American uprising, crafted two plans to crush the rebellion, keeping both in reserve in case one failed. One approach was to strike at the south, advance from the Carolinas and Georgia, moving northward, state by state, subduing each in turn and restoring royal authority. Loyalist sentiment was believed to be strongest in the South, where many wealthy planters still clung to their ties with Britain. With the help of loyalist militias and the might of the British regulars, the Crown hoped to roll up the rebellion from the bottom up. But there was another, perhaps more promising option. Strike at the heart of the rebellion by seizing New York and the Hudson Valley. This strategy was favored for several reasons. First, the British Navy was without rival. Its fleets could blockade American ports and deliver troops wherever needed, while the Americans possessed no real navy at all. What ships they had were mostly converted fishing boats or merchant vessels, manned by fishermen and sailors turned warriors overnight. These daring privateers, operating under special commissions from Congress, harassed British merchant shipping and even dared to attack isolated warships, seizing cargoes and disrupting the British supply lines. Still, they were no match for the mighty Royal Navy in open battle. The second advantage lay in Canada, firmly held by the British. From the safety of Quebec and Montreal, Britain could launch attacks directly down the Hudson Corridor. The vast wilderness between New York and Canada was also home to the powerful Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. Long allied with the British through men like Sir William Johnson, the Iroquois could be a potent ally in harassing American settlements and supply lines in the interior. But the most compelling argument was strategic. If New York could be seized and the Hudson Valley firmly controlled, New England, the hotbed of the rebellion, would be cut off from the rest of the colonies. The flow of men, arms, and supplies between New England and the middle and southern colonies would be strangled. Starved of support, isolated from their allies, the stubborn Yankees might soon be forced to surrender, or so British generals believed. General George Washington, ever perceptive, understood the gravity of the situation. Fresh from the triumph at Boston, he swiftly marched his army to New York City, determined to fortify the approaches and deny the British a foothold. He concentrated his forces on Brooklyn Heights, a rise of land in the borough of Brooklyn that dominated the surrounding countryside, much as Dorchester Heights had in Boston. Earthworks sprang up almost overnight. Cannon were dragged into position. The city braced itself for siege. On August 22nd, 1776, British transports filled the waters off Long Island. Red-coated regulars, gleaming in the summer sun, began to land in force, 20,000 men under the command of General William Howe, supported by Hessians and Loyalists, easily outnumbering Washington's defenders. The Americans, barely more than half that number and many untested in battle, waited anxiously behind their earthworks. In the days that followed, the British launched a well-coordinated assault. Using feints and flanking maneuvers, they slipped through the wooded hills and caught the American lines off guard. The battle was fierce, but short. Hundreds of patriots were killed or captured, and the survivors fell back to Brooklyn Heights. For a tense day and night, the American army stood trapped, its back to the East River, the British tightening their grip. It was a moment of crisis, perhaps the gravest of the entire war. Had Howe pressed his advantage and stormed the heights immediately, the revolution might have ended then and there, with the bulk of the Continental Army captured. But, cautious and unwilling to risk a bloody assault, Howe chose instead to besiege the position, hoping to force a surrender through hunger and fear. Washington recognized the peril. Summoning his most trusted officers, he devised a daring plan. Under cover of darkness and thick fog, he ordered every available boat and barge to be gathered on the river. All night, silent columns of soldiers, horses, artillery, and supplies moved quietly down to the water's edge. Washington himself stood on the bank, overseeing the operation, urging calm and discipline. Boat after boat crossed the dark river, carrying men to the safety of Manhattan. Not a sound betrayed their movement to the enemy. At dawn, as the mist lifted, the last boat left shore, carrying Washington himself. The British awoke to find the heights deserted. The Americans had slipped away as if vanished by ghosts. Howe, frustrated, gave chase, crossing to Manhattan. Washington led his battered army northward to Harlem Heights, fighting skirmishes and rearguard actions along the way. The city of New York, vulnerable and surrounded, was abandoned to the British. As the British swept through the streets, the Americans retreated again and again, moving ever farther north and west. With each passing day, their numbers dwindled. Men's shoes wore out, and those who had none left bloody footprints on the frozen ground. Food and ammunition ran low. Many soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, deserted or went home as their enlistments expired. For those who remained, hope flickered dangerously low. General Charles Lee, whom Washington had ordered to bring reinforcements, delayed for reasons of pride and jealousy. This left Washington isolated and vulnerable as the British pressed their pursuit across New Jersey. The British Army, led by General Cornwallis, felt certain that the end was near. Washington's army seemed on the verge of collapse. In London, the news was welcomed as the beginning of the end for the American rebellion. Cornwallis even began packing his belongings, preparing to return home in triumph. But Washington was not finished. He kept just ahead of his pursuers, burning bridges and destroying stores to slow them down. Finally, he crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, putting a physical barrier between his army and the British. Across the river in Trenton, more than 1,000 Hessians, professional soldiers from Germany, tough and well-armed, settled into winter quarters, confident in their safety. On Christmas night, 1776, as a brutal winter storm raged, Washington made his boldest move. Gathering his ragged, half-starved army, many men without shoes, wrapped in tattered blankets, he led them back across the ice-choked Delaware. Experienced riverboat men braved the freezing waters, hauling men, horses, and cannon through driving sleet and snow. The march to Trenton, 9 long miles, was grueling. 2 men froze to death on the way, and others collapsed from exhaustion. The soldiers' muskets were soaked and useless. When an officer warned Washington that they would be unable to fire, he replied grimly, "Use the bayonet. We must take the town." Before dawn, the Americans struck from 2 sides, catching the Hessians completely off guard. Still drowsy from their Christmas celebrations, the enemy troops rushed into the streets, some only half-dressed, as musket fire cracked through the gray light. Their commander, Colonel Rahl, tried desperately to rally his men, but it was too late. He was mortally wounded, and the Hessian lines collapsed. Only after the battle did the Americans find in Rahl's pocket a warning note he had ignored the night before. Too little, too late. In less than an hour, the town was in American hands. Over 1,000 Hessians were taken prisoner. Supplies, weapons, and ammunition were captured. Not a single American was killed in the assault. The stunning victory at Trenton breathed new life into the Patriot cause. News of the triumph spread rapidly, inspiring hope across the continent and convincing many discouraged men to re-enlist. But Washington knew the British would not let the defeat stand. General Cornwallis rushed from New York with fresh troops, determined to crush Washington's battered army once and for all. By January 6, 1777, Cornwallis's forces had reached the southern outskirts of Trenton. The 2 armies stared at each other across a narrow creek, the fate of the Revolution hanging in the balance. General Cornwallis, though anxious to crush the Americans and bring an end to the rebellion, recognized that his soldiers were weary from the long march and the bitter winter cold. He reasoned that with Washington's army just across the narrow stream from his own, he could watch their every movement and prevent any escape. Satisfied with his tactical advantage, Cornwallis decided to wait until morning, planning a grand assault that would end in the capture of Washington himself. The 2 armies were so close that British sentries could clearly hear American voices drifting across the water, soldiers calling out as they tossed more logs onto their blazing campfires, the clank of shovels and pickaxes as men dug new entrenchments in the frozen earth. All through the night, the American camp bustled with apparent activity. Campfires burned brightly, shadows danced across the snow, and the steady rhythm of work continued, as if the soldiers were preparing for a desperate, final stand. Yet, unknown to the British, this was all a ruse, a carefully orchestrated deception. Washington, ever resourceful, had ordered his men to keep the fires burning and to maintain the clamor of a busy camp, while, in the shadows beyond the light, the bulk of the army prepared to move. Officers hushed their men, and in silence the main body of the Continental Army slipped away under cover of darkness, leaving only a small party behind to tend the fires and create the illusion of strength. As dawn broke, Cornwallis looked across the stream, expecting to see the Americans ready for battle. Instead, he was stunned to find the far bank deserted. Not a single soldier remained, save the flickering remains of the abandoned campfires. The truth dawned slowly. Washington had outwitted him once again. In the stillness of the night, while Cornwallis's men slept and dreamed of victory, the old fox, as the British called Washington, had led his troops in a daring march around the rear of the British forces. Even as the British reeled from their mistake, the thunder of cannons echoed from the direction of Princeton. Washington, seizing his opportunity, had marched his weary men nearly 12 miles to confront a column of British reinforcements bound for Cornwallis. The Americans struck swiftly and with determination. After fierce fighting, Washington's troops broke the British lines, sending the enemy into disarray. Triumphantly, Washington pressed on to Morristown, New Jersey, a rugged defensible position nestled amid rolling hills and thick woods. There, his army could rest, recover, and threaten British positions along the Hudson Valley at a moment's notice. The brilliance of Washington's 9-day campaign astonished friend and foe alike. In a little more than a week, he had led his men across frozen rivers, surprised the enemy twice, and reclaimed control of most of New Jersey, where just days before the British had seemed on the verge of total victory. Now they held nothing beyond New York City itself. The strategic tide had shifted, and the morale of the patriots soared. But while courage and cunning could win battles, they could not pay or feed an army. The Continental Congress, struggling with scant resources and no power to levy taxes, found itself perpetually short of funds. Paper money, hastily printed as a promise to pay the bearer, circulated throughout the colonies. These continental dollars quickly lost value, their worth eroded by inflation and by people's lack of faith in the fledgling government. Farmers and merchants, uncertain they would ever see real coin in exchange, became reluctant to sell goods to the army or the Congress, and prices soared beyond reach. General Washington, desperate to keep his soldiers from deserting, turned to one of his most trusted friends, Robert Morris, a Philadelphia financier whose wealth and connections stretched across the colonies. Morris responded with extraordinary energy and selflessness. On New Year's Day, he crisscrossed the city, knocking on doors both of friends and strangers, soliciting loans, donations, and whatever support he could muster. By noon, he had gathered the $50,000 Washington so desperately needed. The money arrived just in time, saving the army from collapse and allowing Washington to feed and pay his men, at least for a while. As Washington's army regained its strength in Morristown, the British regrouped in New York and re-evaluated their strategy. It was clear that holding New York alone would not bring the colonies to heel. They devised a bold new plan for the campaign of 1777, a grand design to crush the rebellion by cutting the colonies in half. This three-pronged assault was carefully laid out. 1. General John Burgoyne, a flamboyant and ambitious officer, would lead an army south from Canada, down Lake Champlain, aiming to seize Fort Ticonderoga, and then drive straight for Albany, New York. Burgoyne's force included thousands of British regulars, German mercenaries, Canadian militia, and allied Native American warriors. With them traveled a massive supply train, cannons, wagons, livestock, even a traveling theater troupe and officers' wives. It was an army on the move, confident of easy victory. 2. Colonel Barrymore St. Leger was to command a smaller column, moving east from the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario, cutting through the wild and often hostile Mohawk Valley. He was tasked with rallying loyalists and native allies as he advanced, ultimately joining Burgoyne on the Hudson near Albany. 3. General William Howe, commanding the largest British force in America, was to move up the Hudson River from New York City, pushing northward to meet the other two armies in Albany. With their forces combined, the British expected to seize complete control of New York State, sever New England from the rest of the colonies, and choke off the rebel resistance. With confidence in their plan, the British generals set their armies in motion as soon as spring weather allowed. In June 1777, Burgoyne's troops swept south from Canada, quickly besieging and capturing the storied Fort Ticonderoga. The fall of this crucial stronghold sent shockwaves throughout America. When the news reached King George III in London, he reportedly leapt from his chair and exclaimed with glee, "I have beaten them. I have beaten all the Americans." The British believed victory was close at hand, but the coming months would reveal just how wrong they were. Burgoyne's campaign, so full of promise at its outset, quickly bogged down in the unforgiving wilderness of upstate New York. The land between Lake Champlain and the Hudson River was a tangled maze of dense forest, muddy bogs, and swift-running streams. The Americans, too weak to meet Burgoyne head-on in open battle, turned to clever tactics of delay and harassment. Everywhere the British turned, they found their path blocked. Great trees had been felled across narrow trails, bridges smashed and sent tumbling into rushing rivers, and even the roads themselves churned into impassable quagmires by sabotage. Each mile forward required the building of new roads and bridges, sapping the strength and spirit of Burgoyne's army. Worse still, Burgoyne's long supply lines stretched back all the way to Canada, guarded only by small detachments of tired men. As he inched southward, he was forced to leave behind precious soldiers to guard the endless convoys of wagons and artillery, thinning his ranks for the battles ahead. The British advance slowed to a crawl, plagued by ambushes, hunger, and fatigue. Knowing his army desperately needed food, horses, and ammunition, Burgoyne set his sights on Bennington, Vermont, where, as he inched southward, he was forced to leave behind precious soldiers to guard the endless convoys of wagons and artillery, thinning his ranks for the battles ahead. The British advance slowed to a crawl, plagued by ambushes, hunger, and fatigue. Knowing his army desperately needed food, horses, and ammunition, Burgoyne set his sights on Bennington, Vermont, where a large cache of American supplies was rumored to be stored. He dispatched a force of about 1,000 Hessians, tough, disciplined German mercenaries, confident they would sweep aside any resistance. But the Americans had other ideas. Led by the fierce and independent-minded Colonel John Stark, a former British officer turned patriot, hundreds of New Hampshire and Vermont militiamen assembled to meet the threat. On a hot August day, Stark's men waited behind fences and stone walls as the Hessians advanced through fields and woods. The fighting was fierce and close. Musket shots echoed among the trees, and the air filled with the shouts and smoke of battle. Stark urged his men forward with the cry, "There are the redcoats. We'll beat them today, or Molly Stark's a widow." The patriots fought with such fury that when the smoke cleared, almost all of the Hessians were dead or captured. Only about 70 made it back to Burgoyne. The rest lay wounded or prisoners, their hopes and Burgoyne's dashed. This stunning defeat at Bennington was a devastating blow, robbing the British of much-needed supplies and further thinning their army. Meanwhile, the second part of the British plan was playing out to the west. Colonel Barrymore St. Leger, with a mixed force of British regulars, loyalists, and several hundred native warriors from the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, pushed into the wild Mohawk Valley. His first target was Fort Stanwix, also known as Fort Schuyler, a sturdy American outpost garrisoned by about 600 Continental soldiers. St. Leger laid siege to the fort, hoping to crush resistance in the valley and link up with Burgoyne on the Hudson. News of the siege galvanized the local militia. General Nicholas Herkimer, a tough old German-American farmer and leader, gathered 800 men to march to the relief of Fort Stanwix. As Herkimer's force pushed through the tangled forest, they were ambushed by a detachment of British, Loyalists, and Mohawk warriors near the tiny village of Oriskany. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest and most chaotic of the entire war. The Americans, caught in a deep ravine, found themselves under fire from all sides. Musket balls and arrows rained down from the tangled undergrowth. Herkimer himself was shot early in the fight, his leg shattered, but he refused to leave the field. Sitting beneath a tree, propped up and bleeding, he calmly lit his pipe and barked out orders, encouraging his men to stand firm. The fighting raged for hours, often hand to hand. The cries of the wounded and the crash of musket fire echoed through the ravine. But the American militia, inspired by Herkimer's courage, gradually pushed their attackers back. At last, battered but unbroken, the Americans held the ground. The British and their allies withdrew, leaving behind many dead and wounded. Inside Fort Stanwix, the defenders seized their opportunity. They launched a surprise sortie, captured enemy supplies, and returned triumphantly with 5 British flags. In a symbolic gesture, the Americans raised the captured flags upside down over their ramparts. Then, above them all, they hoisted a new banner, the first version of the American flag, hastily sewn together from whatever cloth they could find. A white shirt, a blue coat, strips of red petticoat. These scraps became the stars and stripes, fluttering for the first time over an American fortress. The men cheered and saluted the rough improvised flag, their hearts swelling with pride. This moment reflected a larger decision made by Congress just weeks before. In June 1777, the Continental Congress declared that the new national flag would consist of 13 alternating red and white stripes, symbolizing the unity and strength of the original colonies, and a blue field with 13 white stars in a circle. Red stood for valor, white for purity, and blue for unity. Betsy Ross of Philadelphia had sewn the first official flag, but the version raised at Stanwix was a patchwork, rough but meaningful, a true flag of a people at war. As the siege at Fort Stanwix dragged on, hope for the defenders was running thin, but help was on the way. The bold and resourceful Benedict Arnold, then still a trusted hero, was marching north with reinforcements. Knowing that his numbers were too small to guarantee victory in a pitched battle, Arnold resorted to trickery. He captured several British soldiers and convinced a friendly Oneida Indian to help spread wild rumors through the surrounding woods. Stories that Arnold's army was vast, unstoppable, and already surrounding the British. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The native warriors fighting with St. Leger, fearful of facing overwhelming odds, began to melt away, disappearing silently into the forests. As panic spread, St. Leger lost control of his force. In confusion and haste, the British abandoned their siege, retreating back to Oswego and then to Canada, leaving behind supplies, equipment, and even their sick and wounded. Fort Stanwix was saved, and Burgoyne was now alone, cut off from the help he had been counting on from the west. All Burgoyne could do was push forward, and hope General Howe would fulfill the third prong of the plan. But in the wild, tangled land of northern New York, the British dream of victory was slipping away. Meanwhile, as General Burgoyne struggled in the northern wilderness, the third and most ambitious part of the British strategy unfolded in the middle colonies. General William Howe, commander of the British forces in New York, was expected to march north and join Burgoyne at Albany, sealing the fate of the American cause. But politics, pride, and treachery combined to change the course of the campaign. In Howe's headquarters, day after day, British officers gathered around maps, debating their next move. Among them sat a man whose name would forever be associated with betrayal, General Charles Lee. Once a trusted American commander, Lee had become embittered by jealousy and frustrated by his own capture at the hands of British dragoons. Facing an uncertain fate, he turned traitor. In whispered meetings, Lee laid out the secrets of the American army to his captors, revealing not only troop strengths and deployments, but also the personalities and weaknesses of American leaders. He assured Howe that General Washington had foolishly depleted his own forces in New York, leaving the main American army weakened and exposed. Howe, ever the opportunist and still waiting for direct orders from London, saw an opening. Instead of marching north to support Burgoyne, he turned his ambitions toward Philadelphia, the bustling heart of the Revolution and the seat of the Continental Congress. Capturing Philadelphia, he believed, would cripple the rebel cause and demoralize its leaders. Howe's first gambit was a classic feint. He tried to lure Washington out from his well-defended positions around Morristown, tempting the Americans to risk a pitched battle on open ground. But Washington, cautious and wise, refused to be baited. Realizing the direct route would not yield victory, Howe embarked on a daring and unexpected move. Embarking his army onto ships, he sailed south around the tip of Delaware and up the Chesapeake Bay, a journey of over 300 miles. Landing near the mouth of the Elk River in late August, the British marched inland, drawing ever closer to Philadelphia. Washington moved swiftly to block the advance, setting up defensive lines along Brandywine Creek, just southwest of the city. On September 11, 1777, the two armies clashed in one of the largest battles of the war. Over 29,000 soldiers, 11,000 Americans against 18,000 British and Hessians, collided in rolling fields, woodlands, and along the banks of the creek. For hours, musket fire and cannon smoke filled the air as regiments surged forward and fell back. Washington fought valiantly, but superior British numbers and tactics eventually forced the Americans to retreat. The loss was heavy, but Washington's resilience was unbroken. Despite the defeat, Washington did not allow Howe to rest. Harassing the British columns as they advanced, the Americans slowed Howe's march to a crawl. The British general, frustrated by bad roads, heavy rain, and constant skirmishes, took 2 exhausting weeks to cover just 26 miles from the Chesapeake to Philadelphia. Even after the city fell into British hands in late September, the Americans continued their attacks. At Germantown, just outside Philadelphia, Washington struck again. The battle was fierce, with both sides suffering significant losses, but once again the British held the field. To many, it appeared as though Washington was repeatedly leading his men into defeat. Whispers grew among the people. Was their general too reckless or even incompetent? Yet those who understood Washington's strategy recognized the genius at work. By keeping Howe's army constantly occupied, Washington made it impossible for the British to send reinforcements north to Burgoyne. Every engagement, even if lost, served to bleed British strength and pin down troops that otherwise could have marched to Albany. While Howe celebrated in Philadelphia, far to the north, the situation for Burgoyne grew desperate. Expecting help that never came, Burgoyne moved south of the Hudson and entrenched his weary, depleted army near the village of Saratoga. There, the Americans, under the determined command of General Horatio Gates, and aided by brilliant young officers like Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan, closed in. As Burgoyne tried to break free, a detachment of Americans surged north, severing his line of retreat and cutting him off from Fort Ticonderoga and vital supplies. Now isolated, outnumbered, and hemmed in by thousands of patriot soldiers, Burgoyne was left with only one option: fight. 2 major battles erupted at Saratoga. In the first, the Americans repulsed repeated British assaults, driving them back with deadly rifle fire from behind hastily built earthworks. In the second, after days of maneuver and brutal combat, the British suffered a crushing defeat. British soldiers, exhausted and hungry, fell back as their officers fell, one after another. Encircled and with no hope of relief, Burgoyne saw that further resistance would mean certain destruction. On October 17, 1777, with the autumn leaves blazing red and gold in the New York woods, General John Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 soldiers, along with cannons, wagons, muskets, and banners. It was the greatest British defeat yet, and a stunning victory for the young American cause. The carefully crafted British strategy to split the colonies in 2 had collapsed, the first of their great plans ruined. News of Burgoyne's surrender reverberated around the world. In Europe, statesmen and kings took notice. In France, the long skeptical government now recognized the Americans as a real nation, and an ally worth supporting. In the grand salons of Paris, the Marquis de Lafayette, already a volunteer in Washington's army, pressed for aid. Within months, France openly entered the war, sending supplies, ships, and soldiers across the Atlantic. Spain and the Netherlands soon followed, turning the American rebellion into a true world war. Though many more battles lay ahead, bitter winters, betrayals, sieges, and sacrifices, the tide had turned. America, recognized at last as a free and independent nation, would never again be merely a rebellious colony.